Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about overcoming cultural relativism. Okay, so for today we talked about or we read James Rachel's "The Challenge of Cultural Relativism." Okay, so if we're going to make, or philosophers are going to make claims about what is right and what is wrong, when we make a statement like that, is that an objective statement or a subjective statement, right? So the idea of like an objective statement is something that can be true or false, right? For example, this thing is a cup. It exists, right? We can kind of verify that fact. We have evidence that suggests that that fact is true, and in fact, it is true, right? And so is when we make claims about morality. Are we making claims that morality is objective, like this cup is real, or is it something subjective, like I like chocolate ice cream? Chocolate ice cream is good. People might disagree about that, and in that way, the way that ice cream tastes to you is a matter of subjective opinion. So we want to ask, is is ethics or is morality something more like ice cream preferences, or is it more like empirical facts, or facts about the universe, right? um, so ultimate question is morality objective or subjective? This is a very important question, because we want to be able to say that morality is in some sense objective, right? So when we say that something like the Holocaust was morally wrong, right, we want to say that kind of for a fact, right? And if somebody disagrees with that and says that the Holocaust was like morally permissible or like morally obligatory, even, that we could say that that person is in some sense wrong, and actually is saying something that's false. So here are four views about the nature of morality. Um, so first is moral nihilism. So according to this view, there is no morality. You can just do things, right? In the Creel text, he says something like, there is no such. He's citing a character from The Grapes of Wrath, the preacher. He says something like, "There's no sin, there's no virtue. There are just things that people do." That's moral nihilism. There is no such thing as a morally right action, a morally permissible action, a morally wrong action. Rather, there's just the collection of human behaviors, and there's really no right or wrong ever. Um, then take this as and oppose it to moral realism, which says that um, morality is in some sense real, right? It's in some sense there is an objective morality. We can make claims about the world and say that something is morally wrong, say something is morally right. And that we can cite reasons and use reason to do this. Um, so the moral theories that we're going to be looking at: consequentialism, virtue ethics, deontology, those are going to be examples of like moral realist practices, moral realist theories. And then there's moral relativism, which says that there are no objective truths about ethics or about morality. Rather, they're just contingent facts about one's culture, right? And then lastly, there's methodological relativism, which is often used in the social sciences, where or in cultural anthropology. The idea is that we suspend judgment um, about rightness and wrongness in order to like make claims about the practices of a given culture. So if I were going to go to a distant culture and just sit and watch what they do, I wouldn't want to be like, oh yeah, they're doing things that are morally wrong. Rather, I would just want to observe and write down things, and let that be the empirical evidence. So it's like a scientific method where we suspend our ethical judgment. Um, so Let's get a little bit clear on what cultural relativism is. So there's cultural relativism and there's individual relativism. Individual relativism says that what's right and what's wrong is determined by an individual person, right? Um, uh, so merely in virtue of believing that something is morally okay, it is morally okay, right? So if I were to like karate chop somebody in the face, right? That would be something that would be morally permissible so long as I think that it is morally permissible. Okay. Um, and then there's cultural relativism, which says that what is right and what is wrong is determined by one's culture, right? So, given what the culture says about a given issue, that makes it morally okay or morally wrong to do that thing, right? So, if our culture says that it's morally permissible to, say, have an abortion or to destroy a forest or to kill another person, right? That means that um, we it's morally okay to do those things so long as our culture says that it's okay. Now it's not just saying that different cultures have different practices. That's not relativism. That's just clearly true, right? You look at you look at one culture, you look at another culture, they both think that different things are morally okay or morally wrong. um, but what relativism is doing is it's saying that actually what is morally okay and what's morally wrong is just determined by those contexts. So in the one context, it's okay to do X. In the other context, it's wrong to do X. Depending on where you are, it's morally wrong or morally right. That's the idea behind cultural relativism. Okay, so James Rachels offers four arguments for why we should not accept cultural relativism. I'm going to just like go through these arguments, right? So, okay, so the first one here is the cultural differences argument. Now, the cultural differences argument is an argument that favors cultural relativism, right? And so what he's going to do is he's going to give this argument and then he's going to critique that argument, right? So let's talk about the cultural differences argument, which is an argument in favor of cultural relativism. First, empirical fact. Different cultures have different moral codes. Okay, so we look at the world. It strongly seems that in Japan, it's morally okay to do one thing, whereas in India or in Africa or in America, it's not okay to do that thing, right? So it strongly seems that different cultures do, in fact, have different moral codes, different standards. Okay, so number two, the premise two, the best explanation about moral issues is that there are no objective moral truths. The idea here is that um, the disagreement behind these different cultural practices that lends evidence to the fact that there just are no objective moral truths. If there were objective moral truths, people would be in more agreement with one another, right? So um, that's the cultural differences argument, which favors relativism, right? So Rachel's suggests that this argument falls prey to an is ought fallacy. The idea with an is ought fallacy is that we say that, look, the world is this way. We find an empirical fact about the world. And then we deduce from the empirical fact about the world that the world should be that way, that it is normatively that way, or it ought to be that way. So the idea here is that, look, okay, it doesn't follow from the fact that that different cultures have different moral codes that there is that there is no moral truth. It just doesn't follow from that fact. Or cultural relativism does not follow from the fact that different cultures have different moral codes. That's the idea. Um, there are other explanations for the fact that different cultures have different moral codes. For example, can it be possible that one culture is just wrong, right? Given that possibility, right, or given that explanation, it doesn't seem like we can claim that the mere fact that cultures disagree about morality, it follows that there's no truth about morality. Okay, Rachel's offers a second argument. This is a what we can call a reductio argument. So in Latin, reductio ad absurdum means reduce to absurdity is the idea. So this line of reasoning has a very specific structure. First, we want to identify something that we want to argue is false, right? So in Rachel's case, he wants to argue that cultural relativism is false. And then what we do is we assume that that thing is true, right? We assume that the thing that we want to prove false is actually true. And then we see what follows from that thing, right? So I have a picture of two birds here. Let's suppose that we want to, um, suppose you and I are getting into a debate about what a bird is, right? And I say something like, look, a bird is a thing that flies, right? Okay. You could very easily do a reductio argument against my definition of a bird. So I'm saying that a bird is a thing that flies. What you could do is say, okay, let's just suppose that a bird is a thing that flies. What follows from that, right? And it would follow that an ostrich, for example, is not a bird because ostriches don't fly. Also, penguins don't fly either, right? So it seems like we know that penguins and ostriches are birds. So it seems like your definition doesn't work because it has some outliers, right? And so the idea is that with that, you have reduced my definition of what a bird is to absurdity because you have identified that there are things that follow from it that don't make sense, right? Okay, so Rachel's wants to say, okay, look, relativist, if cultural relativism is true, we will have major counterintuitive things that follow from it. Two things. We can't criticize other cultures' moral codes, and we can't criticize our own moral codes, right? So if we wanted to say critique, say Nazi Germany, right, for the Holocaust, this is something that we can't do given cultural relativism, right? We can't say that one culture is wrong. Why can't we say that one culture is wrong? Because that culture is the standard of all morality for that culture, right? So if the culture says it's okay to, you know, kill a bunch of people, right, and do a Holocaust, like have a Holocaust, then that means that it's morally okay to have a Holocaust. That seems completely absurd, right? Um, Number two, it follows that we can't criticize our own cultural code, our own culture's moral code. This means that we can't say that what we've been doing is wrong. For example, most people want to say that slavery was morally wrong. However, given that that was a predominant cultural practice at the time, it would mean that slavery was morally permissible because it was generally accepted by the culture, right? And that seems very odd. It seems like we can critique our own culture. We can critique various practices that are going on today, right? Um, the other thing is we can't make sense of moral progress or tolerance, right? So if we wanted to say that potentially that America has improved morally since we had slaves, right? We couldn't say that. We couldn't say that we've actually made any moral progress. And of that's because it assumes that there's a standard independent of our own cultural standard, right? By which we can improve to be more like that standard. However, if our standard for all ethics is the culture, then we're always at like we're always perfectly in a line with what's morally right, just in virtue of doing what the culture says to do. And so basically, the idea there is that moral progress assumes that there's some ethical standard independent of the culture. So, problematic things follow from cultural relativism's truth. Now, here's a question that we might ask. Um, are cultures really all that different? Um, so it looks like, hey, looks like cultures are vastly different, with all of these different values, with all of these different moral principles, with all of these different practices. Um, but Rachel's wants to say, no, look, even though you have different practices in different cultures, really what you have are shared values. So different practices can point to have shared values. So, for example, argument number three is this very fact, right? So the idea with cultural relativism is the cultural relativist wants to say, look, um, cultures are so vastly different. We given that they're so different, there's no truth about ethics. We cannot judge any other culture, right? Every culture just needs to be left alone to do the practices that it does because all the cultures are so different. What Rachel's is saying is that really these cultures are actually very, very similar. Um, Even though the practices aren't similar, the values are the same, right? So, for example, he gives the Eskimo example, right? And the Eskimo example, it's they have infanticide, right? But they have a good reason for doing that, right? Because the tribe would not survive if it had a population that was that big, right? So we have one culture, infanticide is okay. We have another culture, infanticide is wrong, right? Um, Really, if we look at the reasons why these practices exist, they're very similar values. Namely, in one culture, you care about whether or not the population can be sustained, but in the other culture, that's also a value as well, right? And so if it's not just infanticide, non-infanticide, rather we have to look at the reasons why those things exist. Um, Similar to like say there's a culture that that views um, that views cows as sacred, right? We have one culture where it's morally wrong to eat beef. We have another culture where it's morally okay to eat beef. That means that there's no morality about whether or not eating beef is morally okay or morally wrong, right? Um, but the idea there is that look, in the one culture, there's the the beef is not the beef, but the cow is like a person, right? And so you don't want to kill and eat the cow because the cow is like a person, right? And so that's the value, is to not eat other people, to say not eat your grandmother. And but then in the other culture, that doesn't say that the cow is a person, it's still wrong to eat people, right? So the value is to not kill and eat people, right? But the practices look different because who is a person is different between these cultures. So the idea here is that uh, cultures are actually not all that different. They have similar values. For Rachel's fourth argument, I'll talk about it just very briefly. He says that some values are just absolutely necessary for any society to function. So, for example, um, imagine what a society would look like if it had no norms against lying. We could never trust one another. We could never like function as a society. Like uh, uh, lying has to be stigmatized or has to be condemned for societies to function at all. Same with like killing other people, right? You can't have a society that functions well that doesn't condemn the practice of killing somebody else for no good reason, right? And so it strongly seems that even though there are different practices, there are some values that have to be appreciated in order for society to function at all. That's the idea here. And this offers evidence for thinking that cultures have vastly different moral codes. Really, they may have like different moral practices, but their codes are very similar, actually. And that's meant to undercut the um, the cultural relativists' claim. Yeah. So the idea here is that um, we can judge other cultures, right? Different cultures can critique one another, different cultures can grow from one another's moral practices, right? And because it seems like the evidence that we have for adopting relativism is actually not good evidence that suggests that relativism is true, right? So we've gone over four arguments that suggests that cultural relativism is problematic in some way. Um, we have we've demonstrated those arguments. We've defined cultural relativism, and so we will now, for our next few classes, we'll be talking about moral theories, prescriptive and comprehensive theories that tell us what is morally wrong and what is morally right in what is supposed to be every single circumstance. So now that we've gotten rid of or now that we've suggested that cultural relativism is morally problematic, we can move on to how we can flesh out objective moral truth.